everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We're delighted to see such a big turnout, but perhaps also not surprised given the topic of conversation and discussion this evening. It's clearly one that is exercising our minds, dividing opinions, and causing great concern within our community and beyond. For years, I was kind of cautious to steer the AJR clear of matters relating to Israel because it's been quite a sensitive subject, but clearly something has changed. The world has changed since 7th of October, and it's no longer possible to separate Israel, the diaspora, anti-Semitism, and Holocaust distortion. And as organizations working in the field of Holocaust remembrance and education, the AJR and the VINA are both deeply sensitized to the murder of Jews because they are Jews, and in particular, that among the killed and the displaced and abducted are Holocaust survivors. So tonight we're going to try and navigate a complex historical, yet topical, legal, moral, and social issue. And I'm aware that there will be a range of opinions and points and arguments and statistics that will be discussed, as well as sources of information. In planning the event, the original intention was to have an in-person gathering at the VINA Holocaust Library, but such was the interest that I think we could have filled the library 3 times over. And so we've gone back to the future to be on Zoom when we can all smile and tell each other that everything is normal. And when we ran our Zoom events in lockdown, we encouraged participation through the chat function, and kept our audience on mute to aid the flow of the event. And the same will be the format for today's meeting. And towards the latter part of the event, there will be an opportunity to read out questions and points that you pose to our panelists. So please do send in your comments and questions using the chat function. The only guarantee I will make is that I won't get around to reading all of them, most probably. But before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to give a quick shameless plug to the AJR, for the AJR, just in case there are some of you that are less familiar with our work. So we are the national organization that represents and supports Holocaust survivors and refugees and their descendants. And as part of our primary and overriding objective, it's to deliver social welfare services to Holocaust survivors and refugees. We also receive funding from the German government to provide social welfare support for that unique community. So although this is tangential to tonight's discussion, if any of you are aware of anyone who might need any assistance, please do let us know, because we really do want to hear from people. And our mission extends beyond that first generation support to engaging with the descendants of the refugees and survivors, the second, the third, and even the 4th generation, so that they can be involved in our work and perpetuating the stories and legacies of their families. And we are also an educational and commemorative sponsoring, benefacting organization, also with our own resources. Some of you may know our testimony projects, in particular Refugee Voices and My Story. But my main message is that you should, if anyone's interested who's not yet a member, please do sign up. It's never too late to become a member of the AJR. Last year, we enrolled over 20 first-generation Holocaust survivors and refugees, including one lady aged 103. And I'm now happy to say she's 104. There's great longevity by joining the AJR. And also just to, I suppose, to reciprocate what Toby mentioned, it's a great pleasure to be sharing a platform with our friends and colleagues at the VINA Holocaust Library. We at the AJR describe ourselves as having been well established. We were founded in 1941. Well, the library is our big brother and looks very healthy as it celebrates its 90th anniversary. So thank you, Toby and Elise from the library, and to Deborah from the AJR for organising this event. And also thank you to our panelists. Natasha Hausdorff is a barrister and expert commentator on international law, including the law of armed conflict, foreign affairs, and national security policy. She holds law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities and was a fellow in the National Security Law Program at Columbia Law School in New York. Natasha previously worked for American law firm Skadden Arps in London and Brussels, and clerked for the President of the Israeli Supreme Court, Chief Justice Miriam Naor in Jerusalem. She voluntarily serves as the legal director of the UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. And also to Ben M. Freeman. Ben is the founder of the modern Jewish Pride movement. He's a leader, thinker, and educator, and the author of Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People and Reclaiming Our Story, Pursuit of Jewish Pride. He's an educator, and his work focuses on Jewish identity and historical and contemporary Jew hatred. He's a Holocaust scholar for over 15 years and came to prominence during the Corbyn Labour Jew hate crisis in the UK, and quickly became one of its generation's leading thinkers and voices, and voted number 8 on the inaugural 25 Young Visionaries list by the Jerusalem Post and JNF USA. And he's also a Jewish diplomat for the World Jewish Congress, a research fellow for the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism Policy, and a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. Natasha, Ben, welcome. Thank you very much for doing this. And as are the vagaries of this subject, so much has happened just in the last few hours, the last day or so, let alone since 7th of October. But perhaps we could start by asking Natasha to give an overview of what happened going back to 7th of October and where we are now. And then, Ben, if you could comment on the reaction to what happened from around the world to those events. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael, very much indeed for the invitation. It's very good to be with you, and I think so important that we're addressing the developments of the last few months in the context of Holocaust remembrance, because, of course, on the 7th of October, we saw the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, and the slaughter of 1,200 Israeli, not just Israelis, of course, but those living in the south of Israel. They included foreign workers, and the abduction of over 200 hostages. This was in the context of over 3,000 terrorists infiltrating into Israel, not just Hamas. I think it's very quickly forgotten that amongst the terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October were Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, affiliates of Fatah. So the so-called moderates in this equation, the PA, had affiliates that crossed the border on the 7th of October. And many of those that had, in fact, orchestrated this attack over 2 years of planning had done so with the benefits of Palestinian Authority salaries under the Pay for Slay program. And the context of that horrific attack, which many people have said was shocking in the fact that it happened, that Israeli security forces were caught off guard to such an extent, and the repercussions were worse than many people's worst nightmares. Shocking in that respect, but perhaps not surprising, given that the rhetoric of Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations has been clear, both before the 7th of October and importantly subsequently, because after the 7th of October, we've heard members of the Hamas leadership vowing to repeat the 7th of October attacks again and again. Now, I know our audience will be intimately familiar both with what happened on that Black Saturday and subsequently Israel's response. That response, a lawful exercise of self-defense, and one which the IDF has been clear has been conducted in accordance with the laws of armed conflict, much like every other previous operation in the Gaza Strip. It is true that this operation is entirely different in scale and in certainly the length of time and the military objectives, those being to return the hostages, to defeat Hamas, to remove it from its control of the Gaza Strip, and thus to prevent it ever being in a position to repeat the attacks of the 7th of October. Now, those military aims are, of course, far greater than Israel's aims in previous operations, but Israel's conduct in upholding the laws of armed conflict, and in fact going even further than the very basic, one may argue, rules of law applying to situations of armed conflict, going further than those rules require, that has been a consistent practice of the IDF. Juxtaposed to that, of course, we've seen the international reaction response to it. And I know Ben has just been asked to address that in more detail. The impact on Jewish communities around the world is, again, something the audience will be intimately familiar with. But I think looking at the last few days, as you've referenced, and the developments that we've seen, in particular, the about face of the international community from the support that we witnessed perhaps on the 8th of October to the Israeli response, to the situation that we see now, in particular vis-a-vis Rafah. It's interesting to note perhaps that there is an inconsistency here, and there is a contradiction, perhaps, on the one hand, to have had the political support from around the world for Israel to succeed in its aims of defeating Hamas, for it now to be called to stop short of that, so far as the latest operations in Rafah are concerned, doesn't quite sit with where the international community have been coming from, it seems, at the very start of this process. And actually, speaking on the 8th of October on Sky News about the developing situation, I remarked that this was unfortunately expected, that the support that Israel witnessed in the very early days was unlikely to last. And unfortunately, that has dire consequences, not just for the security of Israelis, but also for the Palestinian people, who, let's not forget, have spent some 16 years under the brutal rule of Hamas, and whose only option for a better future rests with Israel succeeding in destroying Hamas in its entirety.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natasha. I mean, you mentioned there about the response 24 hours afterwards, 7th of October to 8th of October. There was that window where there was an outpouring of support and condemnation of what happened. But we also are acutely aware that in the weeks subsequent of the rising anti-Semitism, I think the CST, Community Security Trust, pointed to an exponential rise in attacks far greater than any other point on their measures in their history. Ben, if I could bring you in here to talk a bit more about the reaction, the response, not just from within the UK, obviously we're based here, but around the world to what happened on 7th of October.
Absolutely. And also thank you so much for having me. And just to say, I could listen to Natasha talk all day. Before I speak about the kind of non-Jewish response, I do want to speak about the Jewish response, because I believe that we should be centered in our own experiences. And we have experienced the 7th of October, whether we're in Israel or in the diaspora. And what has struck me is something that is really profound and quite extraordinary, the kind of rare moment where the Jewish community is quite unified. At least the majority of the Jewish community. There has been a focus of love and support towards Israel, which I think has really been one of the only silver linings to this awful experience. But I will say that I think the Jewish community is really suffering a trauma. And I think that the kind of psychological impact of what we've experienced in the last 4 months will become more clear as we kind of move forward. It'd be interesting to see where we are at the year anniversary, how the Jewish community is responding. And it's quite extraordinary if you have a long view of history. This is the first opportunity or the first instance in Jewish history where mental health has been prioritized. And obviously that's so important. But with regards to the non-Jewish population, I think there were those who were shocked. But I think what we've learned from the Holocaust is that shock does not necessarily equal allyship. And we have not seen people pouring to the streets in support of Israel, even in the days following October 7th, as we have done with other atrocities, other genocides. And that to me is something that's really interesting because everyone is talking at the moment about the silent majority. And people try to make me in my own life and us as Jews feel better by saying, it's not everyone that is against you. There is a silent majority. And my response is often, well, they are silent. And if they're not willing to stand up, then they're quite irrelevant, to be honest. And what we are seeing instead is probably a fairly small group of people in comparison, but a group of very loud, aggressive, and passionate people who have been taken to the streets all over the world. And from the 8th of October, it's not just in response to Israel's response. It was the minute October 7th happened, we had groups in the world's capitals, on the streets of the world's capitals, who were shouting chants against Jews. We had it in Toronto, in London, in Sydney. They famously seemed to shout Gaza Jews, but it seems laterally they just shouted, "Where are the Jews?" Which is not really much better, actually, if you ask me. And as Natasha very accurately pointed out, we had the support of the world's governments, or most of the world's governments, or the Western governments anyway, momentarily. And that has vanished like we knew it would. And we also saw, rather unsurprisingly, those that I would kind of put in the human rights organization world. They either ignored what happened, erased the Jewish experience, or denied it. If we look at the crimes specifically against women that were committed by Hamas and their allies on October 7th, the feminist organizations of the world have been completely silent. And the phrase, "Me too, unless you're a Jew," emerged in response. And I think that what we have faced is, at least in our lifetime, my lifetime I can speak of, an unprecedented hurricane of Jew hatred which has swept the world. And I think that Jews, again, to center the Jewish experience, I think that Jews are frightened and I think that Jews are traumatized, but I think we're also seeing something really extraordinary, which is a defiance. There have been many Jewish people who have begun to wear Magen David, Star of David, where another symbol of Jewishness, have recommitted themselves to Jewish action, even in a private way. We heard anecdotal evidence of people who were lighting the Chanukiot or lighting Shabbat candles. And that, to me, in my work, is really a fascinating and wonderful thing, that we are investigating and honoring and living our civilization. But I would say there are dark roads ahead, particularly with regards to the non-Jewish response and the silence of the silent majority and the aggressiveness of our those who I would describe as our enemies, which does not seem to be letting up. And I can say very personally that there are, and I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on this, Natasha, there are areas of London that I will just not go to on the weekend anymore. So it does impact our lives in a very tangible way. It's not just that for Jews living in Britain or in other parts of the diaspora, this is happening in Israel, and yes, we might know people, or yes, we might feel connected, but our lives here are unchanged. I can speak for myself and say that my life has very much been changed, and I don't feel the same as I did pre-October 7th with regards to even navigating London.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's interesting you say about symbols and markers of Judaism. People also having, a number of people having tattoos with or Hebrew writing, Magen David's, which is clearly a sort of permanent symbol, expression of support, solidarity. You mentioned about the support within the Jewish community. Actually, I had a question, but it's going to be later on. I was trying to keep this chronological, but I failed within the first 10 minutes. About whether the opinion of the diaspora has turned against Israel from the Jewish diaspora. I mean, you talked there about support initially, but I suppose it's also in seeing what's happened as and events moved on, whether there's also been a backlash the other way, or an expression for people saying more critical of Israel, whether you identified that.
I think there has been to an extent, but it's generational. I think we can still speak of the Jewish community at large being very supportive of Israel, proudly owning their Zionism, but we are seeing, and we saw pre-October 7th, the growth of anti-Zionism, specifically the rejection of Israel amongst Gen Z and younger members of our society. And I think that is something that again was happening pre-October 7th and has been perhaps intensified, but the context has been intensified. So the spaces those young Jewish people exist in, let's say the left or parts of the left, that specific anti-Zionism has been intensified. So that's the pressure cooker that they're in. But it is happening, and I think it's something that our community leaders need to pay very close attention to, because it could have real ramifications for the future. But I would say at large, I'd be interested in hearing your perspective, Natasha. But I mean, I think at large, the Jewish community has, generally speaking, has not wavered. I think that there is still a huge amount of support, a huge amount of Zionism being openly and proudly expressed. What do you think, Natasha?
I'd say the best antidote to what you're describing are your books, which you might see on the shelf behind me, which are, I think, unparalleled in trying to inject Jewish pride or make it more accessible, specifically for the younger generation, where unfortunately the social media phenomenon and news coming out of TikTok as opposed to more trusted sources has created a wealth of misinformation, which has undoubtedly channeled an awful lot, and I'd say this, reflective of even elements of the Jewish community, to engage in that misrepresentation of the situation vis-a-vis Israel.
Mm.
But 7th of October has changed things significantly, and I think the main arena in which that is likely to have been most prominent is in disabusing many Jews of this notion that there is a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
Everything that we have seen since the 7th of October has proven that anti-Zionism is simply a modern subset, modern form, and the acceptable face today of anti-Semitism, when we see these ancient blood libels being deployed every day in the context of the developments in the Gaza Strip, be they allegations of war crimes or ethnic cleansing, or now even genocide. And the work of the Wiener Library and of Holocaust scholars like Ben in grappling now with this modern Holocaust denial in real time,
Yeah.
which is why I think it's also really, really important to go to Israel if you can and visit the communities that have been attacked, to be able to bear witness and to stand up and push back against the misinformation, the Holocaust denial that we're witnessing, and the vilification of Israel. It's all bundled up in the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism package, unfortunately.
Mm.
Thank you. If I can go back to the 7th of October, the perpetration of what happened and the attacks. I mean, you described it there as 2 years in the making and the worst atrocity, 2 years in the planning, the worst atrocity against Jews since the Holocaust. Even the way the attacks were perpetrated had overtones of the Shoah. The immediate aftermath of what happened, there were a number of narratives, one of which was this abject intelligence failure on behalf of the Israelis. How would you, Natasha, how would you respond to that accusation, I suppose it is?
Well, the Israeli authorities have been clear that this is going to be the first order of business after the war, is to work out what exactly went wrong. But I think what is obvious so far is that there was a real sense of complacency and a buying into this narrative that Hamas would be moderated by economic incentives, that there would potentially be an option to engage with a partner there. I mean, all of this seems utterly ridiculous now, but what had really been overlooked in that context, and this is not just an issue in Israel, but in terms of the international community more broadly, is the impact of 30 years of brainwashing, of indoctrination in UNRWA-run schools. We know, according to the UN statistics, that 3 out of 4 of the terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October were educated in the UNRWA school system under the Palestinian Authority curriculum, which incentivizes martyrdom, teaches kindergarten children that the highest calling in life is to slaughter as many Jews as possible. And of course, that is running in parallel with the pay for slay policy and the salaries for the slaughtered Jews that I mentioned earlier. So I think the biggest failure, other than the immediate security failures on the day, was to seek to what's the best way to put it, to be overly optimistic and to ignore, unfortunately, the real danger signs and the realities. And Israeli society has frequently fallen into that. It comes out of the best of intentions, this desire to seek peaceful coexistence with its neighbors, which has in so many respects, not least in the context of the Abraham Accords, borne fruit. But in the context of Gaza, what we saw with especially the communities in the south of Israel engaging in cooperation projects, water initiatives, driving Palestinians to hospital, those were the people living in the south that bore the brunt of these attacks and this slaughter and torture. And in that context, of course, international pressure has also been critical. I mean, there were 400,000 entrances between January and August 2023 of Palestinians from Gaza into the south of Israel, mostly on work permits. And these were people who came into the communities and worked in the factories or the fields or in construction projects. And many of them were integral in the planning of the 7th of October attacks. The terrorists that came across the border were found with detailed plans outlining household by household the individuals that were there, whether there was a gun in the house, whether there was a dog, how many children, and what they were instructed to do to each family. So all of this was essentially based upon the trust, the confidence that Israel had, and specifically the Israelis living in the south, had put into the prospect of peaceful coexistence. And that is a terrible, tragic lesson to have to learn. But the warning signs, unfortunately, have been there for a very long time. One only needed to listen to the rhetoric of the terrorist organizations themselves, to look at the textbooks, which have been the subject of repeated studies by organizations like Impact SE, and to look at the media broadcasts, which have been the subject of continuing analysis by Palestinian Media Watch. So, the writing was on the wall in so very many respects, and plainly that is all going to be part and parcel of the broader inquiry that Israel conducts after Hamas is defeated.
Thank you. I mean, and that's from the military perspective, whether there was an intelligence failure as well. But also, Ben, I'm interested on the political level, because of course, one of the other assertions is that the government's focus was on, for example, the West Bank and people living there. I mean, the easy accusation would be to say that they're ideologically more aligned with people who were living in the West Bank, and so therefore the government took their eyes of what was happening in the South, for example. Is that something you would agree with, disagree with? How do you see things?
I think it's definitely the case that I think Natasha explained it very clearly, that there was complacency, especially with regards to the South. And I will say very briefly, as a slight tangent, I think we've seen the same idea all over the diaspora with how, and we're still seeing it now to an extent, with how Jews are speaking about the future and a two-state solution. I'm talking about diasporic Jews, which, the reality is there is no, at the moment, a two-state solution would be impossible, and that would be something that would have to come in the future after huge amounts of work. And I think there is still this tendency for, I wouldn't say naivety, but optimism, and maybe not basing our kind of understanding, our perspectives in the brutal reality. But with regards to the West Bank, I mean, it does seem that the vast majority of the IDF were in the West Bank. And I think that makes sense to an extent with regards to the conflicts between settlers and Palestinians, and then the crimes that we've seen perpetrated by settlers against Palestinians. That is a very complicated, messy situation. So it's very clear that there was an eye off the ball. I mean, I think we've seen from Israeli society that the political response has been very negative. We saw government ministers being heckled, going about the public in the kind of the immediate aftermath of October 7th. And I've kind of spoken to my own family who live in Israel, and they'll talk about the political future and who will be in power and whether it will be Bibi, whether it'll be someone else. And I think that people are keenly aware of that. But at the moment, it feels that the job to do is to, as Natasha said, defeat Hamas, and that will come. But yes, I mean, I think again, as Natasha again referenced, there will be a conversation and inquiry as to why the South was left undefended, or why it was defended less than perhaps it needed to be, and why that was.
Just to put the West Bank into perspective, Michael, in the past 12 months, there were 13 Israelis murdered by Palestinians in Jerusalem and 17 in the West Bank, aside, of course, from the 7th of October. So the security situation and the need for a security presence there on that count is something that I think is very quickly lost with the understandable focus that we have now on the 7th of October and of Gaza specifically.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier about the impact on women, particularly the mass raping and mutilation at the supernova. And there was a period, I think it was towards the end of November, so a good sort of 6 weeks afterwards, where you had finally had a UN statement on this, which was kind of seen as kind of weak and very late. And I suppose it's trying to make comparison with whether there would have been a similar statement, a similar time, if there had been another country. And so it's how far out is Israel being singled by the UN. Obviously, we're aware of a lot of resolutions against Israel in the United Nations. But is there something particular that made them put out that statement at that point, so many weeks after what happened, do you think? Is there something else we should be reading into this? Who wants to take that one? Ben, over to you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that they bow to public pressure, and I think that Israel is absolutely being treated with a double standard. I mean, you see that just going around the streets of London. I was away for the weekend in a community in Britain called Rye, the south of England, very nice, very like picture postcard, many Ukrainian flags flying. Of course, not one Israeli flag. And we see continuously, and have seen again, and I think this is the important thing for us to understand, is while October 7th changed everything, there's also many things still going. It isn't business as usual, but the trends that we saw begin years ago, as Natasha said, are still going today, and they're intensifying. So this singling out of Israel or treating Israel with double standards is not new, but absolutely we're seeing it. And I think for many people, many Jews specifically, it was quite shocking to see the Israeli flag projected onto 10 Downing Street, or colors of the Eiffel Tower or the Israeli flag the Eiffel Tower be lit up with the Israeli flag. It was shocking because we're not used to seeing that. But I think many of us understood that that support wouldn't last. And I think the reason that Israel is treated this way, the reason that the United Nations did not comment, is because of Jew hatred. I think that we're seeing Israel be treated as the collective Jew, and it's being singled out with the same tropes, the same libels that have been targeted, or that Jews have been targeted with for millennia. And I think that is what is so crucial to understanding this experience. And Natasha touched on this earlier with the TikTok generation. You know, I'm not on TikTok because I'm essentially too old. But what we're seeing is just a lack of literacy. That not only do they not, these young people, do they not understand Jewish history and the fact that we're indigenous to the land of Israel and the fact that the word Jew comes from Judah, etc. But they also don't understand the history of Jew hatred. They might have learned, for example, about the Holocaust as an isolated thing, an isolated incident, which, you know, their lessons may have begun in 1933 and ended in 1945. And there was no context preceding or even afterwards, you know, with the Kielce pogrom in 1946, that this information has just not been disseminated. And I think that many people have no understanding that what we're seeing now with regards to Israel is, as Natasha said, the modern iteration of ancient ideas. And I believe personally that is why Israel is being treated this way, why it was taken in front of The Hague by South Africa, by people are taking to the streets, and by governments are now backtracking. It isn't even necessarily that everyone involved hates Jews themselves, but there is a culture of Jew hatred, a culture of suspicion towards Israel. And we saw it very clearly, I think, with the despicable debate over how Jewish babies were executed. You know, we saw that, and we saw online that conversation, that discourse. But then immediately we saw, with regards to the hospital that was bombed by the PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, I believe it was, that Israel was immediately blamed, and everyone believed it. And even after the recording of the PIJ speaking about it was released, people still didn't believe it. And I think that's what we're seeing, this cultural, societal, global, perhaps, mistrust of Jewish people.
Natasha?
Well, I wouldn't see the fact that a statement was ultimately squeezed out of UN Women as in any way a positive. I mean, the UN has been the chief negative actor in this conflict, in propagating the conflict, but also anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Israel blood libels. Francesca Albanese has just come out to say the 7th of October attacks were not anti-Semitic, but a response to occupation, supposedly. She's the special rapporteur for the Palestinians. We've had Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, claiming that he didn't know that Hamas had built not just a terror tunnel, but a complex data center under the UNRWA headquarters, the main UNRWA headquarters that used their electricity and internet supplies. We've had Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, claim that all of the revelations recently about UNRWA were news to him, which was utterly disingenuous, when there's been report after report from organizations like UN Watch and NGO Monitor that set out in clear terms that UNRWA has been supporting terrorism from day one. And when we step back and consider that the UN body for Palestinian refugees has been set up to single Palestinians out amongst refugees and give them a separate status which they pass down generation to generation in perpetuity, and ask ourselves, why is that the case, where this doesn't apply to refugees anywhere else in the world? The answer is pretty obvious. It is because this UN organization was set up in order to perpetuate the 1948 war of annihilation against Israel. And it has done so by keeping as pawns these Palestinians, with the hope or the promise, and this is reiterated across Arab media and across the Palestinian Authority and Hamas messaging, that once Israel is annihilated, these generations of refugees will be resettled across Israeli towns. So the UN has been complicit in this. The fact that UN Women didn't see it incumbent upon them to speak out against this grotesque slaughter, rape, and mutilation and sexual violence against Israelis, that in that context, I think is less surprising. If there is anything positive to have come out of the last few months, the fact that this is no longer being brushed under the carpet, the fact that we are no longer seeing the denials end the discussion on this, it is something to hope for. I, for one, would hope that we see the UN bodies operating in the Gaza Strip, in particular UNRWA, being disbanded, that we start from a clean slate, and that we look broader as to the obligations of other states, other surrounding states in the Middle East. And that therein, I think, lies the possibility to seek a workable future for the Palestinian people. I'm sure we'll come back to this concept of a two-state solution, but unfortunately, in the current situation circumstances, that too simply propagates the terrorist authorities that so far have been propped up by the international community and that are unfortunately still governing the Palestinians both in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank.
Thank you very, very much. Just a reminder to everybody, I have received some questions through on the chat function. You can send them directly to me, or you can send them to my colleague Deborah Barnes, and we will try to get to as many as possible in about 25 minutes or so. Just staying in the international sphere, you talked earlier about the South Africa bringing the case to the ICJ. Perhaps a bit of background as to why specifically they brought it, and also how that whole process works. If a country decides that another country is perpetrating genocide, they can just bring a case against the ICJ. I mean, it seems to be that you would have most weeks countries bringing cases against other countries. Perhaps, Natasha, you could elucidate how that process works.
Of course, well, the fact that it was South Africa brought this case was not surprising. It has had a close relationship with Hamas, and unfortunately decided to act as its pro bono legal team. Or there may be some questions as to whether or not there was remuneration for the ANC for the role that it has played here. But the decision that South Africa took specifically to bring a case under the Genocide Convention is important to unpack. It is, in fact, the only way that South Africa could have brought Israel to the International Court of Justice, by using the hook of the Genocide Convention, because both Israel and South Africa are parties to it. The International Court of Justice is a court that deals with disputes between states. So park that from the International Criminal Court, which also sits in The Hague but deals with criminal offences of individuals. So the case that South Africa has brought at the International Court of Justice by using the Genocide Convention is the reason that Israel essentially has partaken, that it attended the hearings, that it made representations, because Israel has accepted the jurisdiction of the court in relation to the Genocide Convention. So that aspect of the technicalities, if you will, behind South Africa's application is important, because it explained why South Africa has used specifically the allegation of genocide in this case. It is as a legal hook to be able to bring Israel under the jurisdiction of the court. It is not, I would suggest, because there is any factual or legal justification for bringing such a case. And contrary to so much of the reporting about the order, the preliminary order that the court gave a couple of weeks ago, where it set down a series of provisional measures, the court has made absolutely no substantive findings, and no findings that Israel may plausibly be in breach of the convention at all. The order of the court is very clear. In fact, there has been a great deal of criticism, very much actually, I should say, in line with the dissenting judgment of the Ugandan judge on the court, who set out very clearly and cogently the legal reasoning that the court ought to have applied in analysing the case that South Africa has brought. The court didn't engage in any of that analysis. It stepped back and it simply asked itself whether the case that South Africa was bringing under the Genocide Convention plausibly fell under the Genocide Convention. That is as far as the court went, and on the basis that it considered that plausibly the rights that South Africa was claiming fell under the Genocide Convention, it decided that it was in a position to pass these provisional measures. And it's important, I think, when we look at what the court actually ordered in those provisional measures, which go no further than Israel's current obligations under the Genocide Convention that Israel has willingly signed itself up to, and that Israel has consistently been clear that it is complying with. But for a report that Israel has been asked to provide the court as to its conduct and its compliance with the Genocide Convention, that was the only substantive addition. Everything else the court ordered was simply restating Israel's international legal obligations, and the Ugandan judge stated that in that respect, the provisional measures were entirely redundant. So the fact that the court has actually not found anything substantive, and the fact that it has not ordered anything substantive, I think are pretty telling. I've heard this judgment be referred to as essentially a diplomatic coup, a piece of paper that essentially doesn't say very much, so that everyone was able, well, nearly everyone on the court bench was able to sign on to it. That is what we were dealing with in terms of the substance of the proceedings. But of course, that has little to no bearing on how that has been presented by South Africa to the world, and how it has been represented by the world's media. And therein, I think, lies the very telling aspect of this, which is that South Africa brought a case which was entirely without merit. The United States, the UK, Germany, amongst others, have been very clear about that. But it did so to win a PR war and as a piece of propaganda, not because it thought that it could achieve what it set out to achieve legally. And in that respect, I see the case that South Africa has brought at the International Court of Justice as uh, a case of, par exemplar of lawfare, of the abuse of legal institutions to pursue a particular political agenda or for a particular purpose. And the danger of lawfare is that it has the effect of degrading the institutions that are used for that purpose. It is an abuse of international law. And in that respect, I think we certainly haven't seen the last of this case at the International Court of Justice. Later this month, from the 19th of February, so this time next week, there will be a series of hearings also against Israel in another case, which is not brought by an individual state, but in fact, it is in the context of a request for an advisory opinion. This is not a legally binding opinion by the court, but nonetheless, it will be used for similar political purposes against Israel. And I have to say, we need to watch this space because all of the blood libels and all of the tropes that we heard the South African legal team levying against Israel several weeks ago will undoubtedly be repeated in the context of the hearings later on this month. So this is a longer process, which unfortunately is without legal basis, but is extremely effective in propagating misinformation against Israel.
Thank you. Ben, have you anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Natasha said everything that needs to be said about that, but I also think it is really interesting that Israel was brought in front of the ICJ of being accused of genocide, whereas on the 7th of October, Hamas did commit genocide. I mean, what Hamas perpetrated on October 7th is a genocide per the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment and the Crime of Genocide, the second article. And I think it's, the language we used is really interesting. We're seeing massacre, pogrom, terrorist attack, but it is a genocide. And I think that Hamas has, and referring to what Natasha said at the beginning, it's not a surprise because Hamas has been very clear about its genocidal aims and has since October 7th sworn to repeat. So I think that there's a kind of a bitter irony there that Israel experienced genocide and then in defending itself was accused of genocide. And I think there's probably not very many countries in the world or people in the world who would have that experience. But because of Jew hatred, that was Israel's experience.
But I suppose it's interesting from a perspective of if you've been accused and you've had to defend yourself against that charge, and then you are eventually found not guilty. I suppose forevermore the taint of the word will follow Israel around. They will be described as a country that was once accused of genocide, and so for those who oppose it or the criticizers will already have that argument lined up for forevermore.
Absolutely. And we also saw that, not from a necessarily legal perspective, but we see that with the accusation of apartheid. We know that Israel is not an apartheid state. Apartheid was a real experience. It isn't just a word to be thrown around. It has a real definition and refers to a very specific experience. But that is now kind of goes hand in hand with the accusations levied against Israel, even though it has no bearing. And that is the danger of these things. And there will be many, many people around the world who do not have Natasha's legal genius, who see the word genocide, see the word Israel, and then make that connection. Again, perhaps because of everything that they've seen on social media, the mainstream media, or even their own bias. And that's why these things are so incredibly dangerous and will absolutely taint Israel even further in the eyes of these racists. Let's call them what they are.
Just widening it out further into the region, I suppose one of the things that happened immediately on 7th of October, people were thinking, does this now precipitate attacks from the north? And what will other countries do? And you've seen continuous rocket fire from Hezbollah and then Israel retaliation. also displaced people from the northern territories because obviously the concern about where those rockets will. Why hasn't Hezbollah launched a greater offensive? Not that I wish it to do so, but why hasn't it?
So I was actually in the north on Monday last week and dealing with this exact question with experts on the border who are monitoring Hezbollah very closely. And there are a couple of schools of thought. One is that Hezbollah has in fact already achieved everything that it would possibly want to achieve at this stage. And so it has no incentive to engage in a higher level conflict with Israel, especially because Hassan Nasrallah is not going to be under any illusions as to what the consequences of that would be in the south of Lebanon and for his forces there. And by having achieved what they could have hoped for, I mean, they're watching, unfortunately, watching very closely Israel's operation in the Gaza Strip. They're learning a great deal about Israel's military capabilities and its approach and its tactics, and all of this is being stored. Hezbollah, another, of course, Iranian proxy, along with Hamas, but Hezbollah is very much more sophisticated than Hamas. They have significantly greater firepower, and they're very much in it for the long game. And so they wouldn't wish to squander their opportunity to really fulfill their aims on a situation where they could simply sit back, wait, see Israel grapple with Hamas in the first instance, and save their military arsenal for a future date. And unfortunately, that threat and that presence is only worsening. It's very interesting to note that especially those monitoring Hezbollah propaganda anticipated that the sort of infiltration and attack that we saw in the south would in fact come from the north. This is something that Hezbollah has been threatening for a substantial amount of time, and it was something that the north was on alert for in many respects, unlike the south. And so it was, this sort of attack was expected in the north and not in the south. Another school of thought is that simply Hezbollah were caught somewhat unawares and sat back in the first instance, wishing to see how things would play out, and then subsequently saw no real advantage to be gained. But of course, that situation in the north of Israel could change in an instant. The arsenal that Hezbollah have is significant. 200,000 missiles of varying degrees of power, but essentially that can cover the entirety of Israel. And what one has to be, I think, clear on in terms of where this build-up has been allowed to take place is that since 2006, it is entirely contrary to international assurances that Israel was given that Hezbollah would not be permitted below the so-called Blue Line, the Litani River. That was the basis upon which the 2006 Lebanon War was concluded. Those assurances and UNIFIL's presence there, supposedly to enforce that, have been shown to be meaningless. And in that context, there are really severe lessons for Israel to learn, both from the north and the south. And the development that we've seen in the last few months of the international community turning on Israel. And that is that it cannot rely on anyone else for its own security. There are over 100,000 Israeli citizens that have been evacuated both from the north and the south since the 7th of October, and they remain away from their communities. That is not sustainable. And there are big questions as to how Israel deals with the threat that Hezbollah poses from the north. And those, the pressure to answer those is really on, because those communities have now spent nearly 4 months away from their homes, their jobs, their farms, their industries. And that's before we even come on to talk about the impact that, of course, this is all having on the Israeli economy. So big questions to grapple with, and ones that the war cabinet is clearly going to have at the front of its agenda, not least once it has successfully defeated Hamas in Gaza.
Thank you. You'll be glad to know that I will stop posing my questions shortly because there's a number have come through on the chat. But just before I get to those, one of the busiest people, it seems to be constantly in the news, is Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, shuttling backwards, forwards diplomacy, number of countries in the Middle East. Ben, do you have a sense of what impact the US presidential election has on the timing for Netanyahu, for this military action, for the conflict?
I think it's my guess is as good as everyone's. I think that everyone is watching America very closely. I think that it's a interesting and maybe very uninspiring decision the Americans have to make. And I think that, and I think it has even farther reaching consequences, not just with regards to Israel, of course, but with regards to NATO, with Russia and Ukraine. What would happen if it was President Trump, the sequel? And I mean, honestly, I have no intel there. I think it's everyone is greatly concerned. I think that people are concerned about the rhetoric of President Biden at the moment. And Natasha referred to this, the kind of swinging or the switching, the kind of rhetoric that came out at the beginning. And now that we're seeing leaks come out with how he's referred to Benjamin Netanyahu and also their kind of perspective on Rafah. But I think Natasha touched on something really important and really interesting, that Israel is the only, or Israel has to be responsible for its own security. And I think, to kind of bring the conversation back around to Holocaust education, Holocaust memory, I recently wrote an op-ed for the Jerusalem Post about never again being a lie. And, we were told never again, and never again will Jews be murdered for being Jews. And I think that what we've seen is that in a very real and tangible way, that was not taken seriously. Real action was not taken to stop our enemies from arming, from speaking out, from committing genocide against the Jews. And I think that is something that whoever is president of America, that we as Jewish people and Israel as a sovereign nation needs to bear in mind, that we are responsible for ourselves, essentially. And some people see that as kind of a depressing thing, that, I understand that, but I also think, again, to live in reality is really important, and to put our faith in people who cannot be trusted, again, for a variety of reasons, doesn't do us any favors. And we saw that very clearly on October 7th.
Just want to turn briefly to how things are in Israel, the state of the country, the psyche. It's obviously a lot in the news. You see a lot of demonstrators protesting about bringing hostages home. You've had families of hostages who've been released saying, continue the war, go further. And you've had other people demanding a ceasefire because they don't want to see any more bloodshed. How would you assess the mood in the country, Natasha? I know you said you've been there recently. How would you say things are? How people are feeling?
So I was there in December first, and then most recently last week. And I have to say that the unity and the resilience that I experienced on both of those occasions is overwhelming and inspiring. The period that I was just recently there saw a lot of the reservists returning home, and I had the opportunity to sort of catch up with quite a few people who'd spent the entirety of the period since the 7th of October in Gaza, and they were reporting the morale amongst Israel's fighting forces was also extremely high. There was a real determination to see this through, to fulfill those military objectives, the return of the hostages and the defeat of Hamas. And that is, I think, important to see, perhaps against the slight anxiety in the last few days, especially, that there's suddenly this real change in the wind in the international community, that Israel is now no longer going to be so easily permitted to fulfill the aims that had international support, certainly in terms of defeating Hamas, that there has been that about change. But so far as, the country more broadly is concerned, absolutely. I mean, there has been a very active campaign amongst the hostage families from the beginning. And the hostage families' headquarters is a place I visited in December, and spoke with many, certainly the organisers, but also many of the individual families. And it's their prerogative to make their case in the way they best see fit. Many of them have said this war needs to be concluded, and the only way to secure the release of the hostages is going to be by putting military pressure, as much military pressure as possible, on Hamas. There are, of course, those that are now calling on the government to enter into a deal with Hamas for the release of the hostages as soon as possible. But of course, Israel can't do that simply by itself. There needs to be I say a willing partner on the other side. I think that's overstating the case as far as Hamas is concerned. But certainly the previous hostage release was secured with the application of intense military pressure to the Hamas leadership. That broke down when Hamas refused to release the remaining female hostages. And we can perhaps think about the reasons for their refusal, and the state of the hostages is a cause of extreme concern to everyone in Israel, from the top of the government right down through society. So it's a question which there are no easy answers to. And as usual, if you ask any individual, they'll probably give you 2 or 3 answers or opinions, each individual Israeli. So there's, as to be expected, lively debate and lots of discussion about this. It is constantly the topic of conversation. The images of the hostages are everywhere you go in Israel. There is no question of them being forgotten. And I think that the critical sort of difference of opinion is how best to go about securing their release.
And Ben, I know when Netanyahu has given a statement, he talks a lot about this term, the fighting the war in terms of months, so implying a long term. Now, the cynic would look and think that's just delaying the inevitable judgment on him and electoral judgment on him. Do you think he has a future beyond this war?
Goodness. Personally, no, I don't. But I think that that is a conversation that will come. I think that the focus right now should be unity, should be completing the aims of the war. And I was thinking, as Natasha was speaking, kind of the incredible scenes that we've seen. I've not been to Israel yet, but my family live there. And the unity we've seen in a country that 5 months ago was experiencing huge amounts of civil unrest. And I think that it's been incredibly inspiring and profound. And I think that just as there will be an inquiry as to how the events of October 7th could take place in the context of Israel's intelligence and Israel's military strength, there will be a conversation about Netanyahu. But I think that conversation is not one that is going to be resolved anytime soon. They're not going to have a wartime election, I don't think. I think that would be unlikely.
Michael, can I just briefly, I completely agree with what Ben said, but just to pick up on the question of months and the lengths of time that this has taken. That was something that I think both the government and the military were pretty clear on from the get-go, that this was not going to be a short war, that the previous operations in the Gaza Strip were going to look completely different to the task that Israel had ahead of it. But I think looking at it from, the perspective of what has been going on the ground, the information that we have about that, and also the steps that Israel takes to comply with international humanitarian law and the precautions to prevent civilian casualties. Therein lies the reason for Israel's slow, methodical approach. It hasn't gone in guns blazing. Israel has the military might to have flattened Gaza in no time at all, but it has done the exact opposite with precision strikes, with military intelligence-led targeted approaches, and that is something that simply takes time, that the balance of this, of course, is that the international community was never going to have a great degree of patience for Jews defending themselves. And, the time in terms of the international discourse was going to inevitably run out at some point. But that has to be balanced against conducting this war in a responsible, lawful manner, and in one that is in keeping with the IDF's extremely high ethical code, which puts the prevention of civilian casualties up there as a critical aim.
There's often been said about Israel defending itself being the most moral army, and you refer there to more ethical processes. According to the Hamas-run military authority, which I know itself has been a questionable source of information, whether it's reliable, in excess of 27,000 Gazans have been killed in the conflict. That is difficult sometimes to square with Israel being a moral and ethical army. Yes, of course, it could go in, as you say, but there are still 27,000 plus deaths.
Well, let me help with that, because I don't think it's difficult at all, on the basis that, first of all, as you say, these figures are coming out of Hamas. They cannot be independently verified. In fact, the names that Hamas have published are less, I think, than 40% of the numbers that it is putting out. So there is clear inflation going on here. We just need to look at the example, you referenced this earlier, on the 17th of October, the Al-Ahli hospital car park strike, which ultimately was found to be a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that fell short in the Gaza Strip and fell into the hospital car park. But it was being reported as an Israeli airstrike that hit the hospital, and immediately in the aftermath of that, there was a suggestion that there were 500 casualties as a result. 500 people had been killed. That figure has never been revised. So that jump that you see on the 17th of October contributes to the figures that you have quoted from Hamas. So the actual numbers are, it seems, inflated, and there's quite a bit of analysis that has been done, especially over the last few weeks, on that specifically. The figures, though, of course, also don't account for all of the deaths as a result of Hamas or other Palestinian terrorist organizations themselves. So them shooting their own civilians, bombing fleeing civilians, both of which have been confirmed by the Americans that there are instances of this. And they also don't account for Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad killing Palestinian civilians indirectly when their rockets fall short in the Gaza Strip, falling indiscriminately and killing civilians who don't have shelters to go to, unlike in Israel. Israeli strikes take into account civilian presence, and they won't strike where it's disproportionate, when there are too many civilians that can potentially be harmed. If a Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas rocket is falling short, that proportionality calculation isn't taken into account. So that element is also missing from the numbers that Hamas are putting out. But the third element that is missing is the number of those casualties claimed that are in fact Hamas terrorists. And Israel has been clear that it has killed, that it is identified and clearly killed over 9,000 Hamas terrorists. So taking all of that into account, and then even using the utterly uncredible Hamas figures, we're actually looking at a civilian to combatant ratio of less than 2 to 1. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu actually quoted in an interview a couple of days ago that the ratio, as the Israelis had it, was 1 to 1. I mean, that's unparalleled in the history of urban armed conflict. If you look at the United Nations figures, they claim that globally the average is something like 9 to 1. 9 civilians killed for every 1 combatant. And according to the Americans, the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan saw casualty ratios of between 3 to 1 and 5 to 1. So we're dealing with a densely populated area where Hamas are using human shields as a matter of course in order to frustrate Israeli lawful strikes. And Hamas's key aim here is to drive up the civilian casualty count, to put international pressure on Israel. And even in that context, the success that Israel has had in keeping casualty figures for civilians down to that extent is jaw-dropping. So it absolutely, when you break those figures down and you remove the misrepresentations, you're again left with a situation where Israel is doing more than any other army in the history of warfare in an unparalleled challenging situation, facing an enemy that is simply seeking to sacrifice its civilians and shooting its own civilians. That there really isn't more that any other army could possibly have been doing in this particular context. And in amongst the mixed messaging that we have heard both from the US and the UK on this, occasionally you will get officials acknowledging that America and the UK probably wouldn't have been able to do what Israel has done in protecting civilian life in armed conflict.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Let's turn to some questions that we've received from the audience. I'll start with Ben. Do you really think Hamas can be defeated? Doesn't the continual bombing by the IDF create ever more supporters of Hamas among the Gazans?
I think it's a really interesting question, but I would personally not view it from that perspective. I think that there has been a long history of radicalization, of brainwashing with children's television programming, with UNRWA schools. And we've, Natasha said 3/4 of the terrorists who perpetrated October 7th, they were educated in UNRWA schools. So I don't necessarily think that we could point to Israel's bombing and Israel's defense of itself and Israel's war as a source of radicalization. You can't really separate them, right? There is this context which already exists, and of course it will be used. Of course, Hamas and other bad faith actors in the strip would use the bombing as justification for their radical anti-Jewish genocidal rhetoric. But I think that the first part of the question is the most important. Can Hamas be eradicated? Given that context, I'm really not sure. And I think that at the beginning of the war, we saw this rhetoric that said Hamas doesn't equal the Palestinians. And I think that we have to have a certain amount of realism and say to probably a large extent it probably does. And that does not mean a civilian is not still a civilian and a child is not still a child. But it's extraordinarily naive, I think, for us to say that there is this clear separation between Hamas and the Palestinian population, given the fact that 50% of the Palestinian population is below the age of 18 and Hamas have been in power for 16 years. So I think it's a really interesting question. It's a very difficult one to answer, but it's not, I would look to Hamas's rhetoric, Hamas's actions as the reason that it would be incredibly difficult to eradicate them. I think there was someone, a Palestinian commentator, who was not our friend, let's say, who was saying that you can't eradicate Hamas because they are the education, they're the hospitals, they're the mayors, they're every aspect of Gazan society, and then also they have a presence in the West Bank. So I think that what we really need to see along with this war, or rather in the aftermath of the war, would be a kind of denazification program. We need to see the Palestinian population, they need to have a civic society of their own, which has nothing to do with Israel and Zionism and defining their identity against Israel and Zionism. But we also really need to see a real program, much more successful actually than the denazification program which took place in Germany after the war, that de-radicalizes them. I think that is the only way that we can really eradicate and defeat Hamas. But if that's not going to be an option, then I think we will be stuck in a cycle of violence, but I would not say the blame lies with Israel. It's because Hamas have so deeply embedded themselves and have essentially brainwashed. I mean, I think that is what we've seen. It's been very clear. We saw that, Mickey Mouse figure, right, Farfour, who was being utilized to teach children about murdering Jews. That is where we should look for the continuation of Palestinian anti-Jewish rhetoric.
I suppose it brings into question the whole viability and feasibility of the two-state solution then, because this is the narrative hitherto. But perhaps, where does it, Natasha, where does it leave that ambition, the two-state solution?
I think it reveals the real damage that paradigm and that framework has caused. And when I visited Ramallah, what has given me most cause for hope is venture capital startup funds looking to create Silicon Valley, looking to create a Palestinian middle class with a stake in society to combat the corruption of Fatah, of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and to really start seeding a future. When you think about how the State of Israel was established, it wasn't a case of overnight you snap your fingers and Ben Gurion declared independence. The state institutions had been built up by the Yishuv in pre-state Israel in the British Mandate for decades. And there was a structure and an infrastructure to the functioning of that state. None of that has been established vis-a-vis the Palestinians because the ethos, unfortunately, of the Palestinian leadership, supported as it has been so many decades from Arab states surrounding it, has been that the creation of a Palestinian state would only be the launching pad for the real war of annihilation against Israel. We have to recognize reality in that. And part of that is to recognize, what is in the best interests of the Palestinian people, what gives ordinary Palestinians the best chance at a prosperous future. It is not under terrorist leadership of the Palestinian Authority and of Hamas in the West Bank. And the idea that you could, create a state where that is the leadership potential and see the Palestinians as better off as a result of it is utterly discredited. The idea that there could be, a creation of basically a replication of Gaza and the West Bank, and Israel would somehow be safer as a result of it is also utterly discredited. And I think we need to step back from this tick box situation, that American president after American president has wanted to embrace, from the handshake on the Rose Garden lawn at the White House through successive agreements of simply signing a piece of paper and that being an end to the conflict. No, we need to recognize reality. This takes work. It takes de-radicalization, denazification. It takes a recognition of international responsibility for perpetuating the conflict for so long, including through these dangerous paradigms, and stepping back from the framework that we have been falsely operating under for so long. And just before we move on, if I just there was a really telling anecdote where Mahmoud Abbas, years ago under the Obama administration, asked how he could possibly be less Palestinian than the president of the United States. This was in the context of Obama's relatively troubling position at the time on settlements. And he was demanding a moratorium on building, which was not something that Abbas was seeking in the context of negotiations that were envisaged at the time. And he said, how can I be less Palestinian than the president of the United States? How could he ask for anything less than America was asking for on his behalf? And so often the international community has hamstrung even Palestinian leadership when it's been more moderate in the past, and set down various demands, considering that Israel is the reasonable, responsible party, so there should be greater demands put on it. Well, let's step back. Let's see what's happened on the 7th of October, and let's start with some really basic demands. Stop funding terrorism, stop incentivizing it, stop child abuse in kindergartens, encouraging them towards martyrdom, and start looking after the interests of ordinary Palestinians, of building a prosperous society, because that's the only route to coexistence. And the imposition of a two-state formula or whatever other formula is deeply, deeply unhelpful for the incremental progress that needs to be made, which is going to take a lot of hard work.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions about specifically the situation in the UK, about the political life here, and sources of information, where you can get credible sources of information about what's happening. Well, the obvious thing to do is to read Ben and Natasha's blogs and books. But outside of that, where should people be going to that I think is generally considered to be a balanced perspective of what's happening? Where would you recommend? I say this in the context of a couple of questions about the BBC, but I also would then add the rider that there's criticism of the BBC the other way, that they're also sometimes accused of being pro-Israel. Where would you suggest?
And I would say the same thing that I would say to my students, that you have to be looking at a variety of sources. You know, it's each individual person will make up their minds about whether they want to engage with the BBC. Some people will still see value in that, understanding the context of the discussions we've had, not just since October 7th, of course, but specifically since October 7th. But yeah, I would think you have to look at a variety of sources. I would not say look at Al Jazeera, number one. I also think that it's important to, I think it's the same conversation we have with regards to media, with regards to human rights institutions, that I think that we have been brought up, particularly in the West, to have trust in specific either institutions or entities, you know, the BBC being one. And I think it's really important to, whether you engage with them or not, to understand that they're not infallible, to understand the context of the criticism, and to understand that we should all be going into whichever media, whichever source we're examining with a critical eye, and understanding that we have to do our due diligence and not just having blind faith. I think that is what, in my life anyway, many of my non-Jewish friends and allies have been discussing with regards to the United Nations, with UNRWA, with all of these different organizations that we've seen have real culpability in what's been happening. And I'm not saying the BBC does, but as kind of an extended example, that we have to rethink the way we engage with these institutions and the media. And we have to also understand that when we're discussing Jew hatred and the history of Jew hatred, what we're talking about is a culture which exists in the world, right? We can talk about it in the UK. It absolutely exists in the UK. And, you know, I hear people talking about the media. It's like the media is made up of individuals who have been raised in this country, who have been socialized in a variety of different ways, right? It's not just one specific way. But, you know, in terms of, I'm not going to sit here and list these are credible sources. I think it's really important to see what a variety of sources are saying from within a boundary. Again, I would not be saying be going to Al Jazeera, but it's okay to read The Guardian, to read the BBC, The Telegraph, The Times, even the Daily Mail, if you're doing so with a critical eye and accumulating a variety of sources. I think that is what we have to do to avoid populism, to understand different perspectives, to not exist in an echo chamber. And of course, I think, you know, Natasha kind of touched on this, I think, that we have to also believe people when they tell us who they are. And when we investigate Palestinian perspective, or even indeed Israeli perspective, we should be looking to them. We should be reading their sources, their media, their outputs, and not necessarily just waiting or relying on the West to interpret. Because I think a lot of this would be a lot simpler if people actually believe or investigated and then understood what Hamas has been saying or doing. But that was just a brief aside.
And Natasha, perhaps could you just comment on what you think, particularly second and third generation? I mean, that's the audience with us tonight, Holocaust refugees. But what kind of initiatives or actions can people make? I think there's been a sense of kind of hopelessness at watching this, a bit like you can watch the numbers on, you know, the numbers of casualties, or watch the war developing. But are there practical things you think people can be doing to bring pressure, or to pledge support, or get involved somehow?
I think following on really from Ben's contribution just then, which sort of took the words out of my mouth really, educating yourself as much as possible about the situation, and being in a position to push back on so many of the misrepresentations. And one of the ways really of doing that, and of reading a breadth of media with this critical eye, is to understand, I think, how the media goes about reporting on Israel. And there are a series of very interesting essays that were written gosh, over 10 years ago, probably now, by a journalist called Freeman when he was working for the Associated Press in Jerusalem, where he analysed, the editorial process and the groupthink that journalists sort of very quickly became inducted into to sell a particular story, whether or not it had any bearing, unfortunately, on the facts on the ground. And we have seen, the situation that Matthew was describing really just snowball. And the examples across the BBC of some things they've apologized for, some things they've not yet apologized for, but blood libel upon blood libel, including allegations of Israel, summarily executing prisoners. If you are well versed in media coming out of Israel, and you understand, basic things like how the IDF operates and what its ethical code is, you know that allegations like that are grotesque, are completely baseless. And when we come to, responsibility of second and third generation survivors of the Holocaust, there is, I believe it's incumbent on all of us, but by all means, on those in particular, and in those younger, the younger generation, to call out those falsehoods, because the parallel of allegations, false allegations against Jews that led up to the Holocaust and then throughout the Holocaust, those parallels are too strong and too striking to ignore. And the importance of combating anti-Semitism and calling out Holocaust denial and pushing back against the blood libels. I mean, that's a sort of tripartite plan of action, I would suggest, that all requires a knowledge base and a sort of fluency in the current circumstances and the current events. I know it's not easy. It's emotionally, I appreciate, extremely charged and difficult. But in a sense, it is also, well, I think it's the privilege of my life to be in a position where I can seek to contribute in this way and to push back against the blood libels. The canard of Jews killing Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals was widely believed in the Middle Ages. The allegation that Israel is targeting civilians or seeking to kill Palestinian children is widely believed now. But we have so many more tools at our disposal today to push back against those falsehoods than our forefathers in the Middle Ages could possibly have dreamt of. And I think it's incumbent on us to seek to use them at every opportunity.
And if I may, I know we're at time, but I think that I think everything Natasha said is supremely important. And I think for Jewish people, there's another layer, which is understanding our story, slightly divorced from the experiences we suffer at the hands of the wider world. What does it mean to be Jewish? We have seen in the last, especially since the Emancipation, since the Enlightenment, end of the 18th, 19th century, that Jewish identity has been warped. We see the non-Jewish world feel it has a right to define Jewish identity. And we really need to understand that Jews are the only ones who get to define Jewish identity, which really speaks to this, because we see the Jewish indigeneity, Jewish connection to the land of Israel be completely erased and vanished. And we need to understand who we are. We cannot be looking to the wider world to understand what it means to be Jewish. There is a real, tangible, rich 3,500-year history that we should understand. And also, from an emotional perspective, we cannot be basing our Jewish identities on fighting Jew hatred, on defeating, anti-Jewish ideologies. We have to also base it on understanding the Jewish experience and living it and being active Jews. And for me, I just want to say the very last thing, that has been a wonderful salve in the past 4 months. Jewish action, Jewish ideas, Jewish education that are divorced, that are separate from Jew hatred, separate from Hamas, because we have a story to be told that is much larger and bigger. And it gets lost sometimes because many of us feel this, and I understand it too, this desperate need to fight back. And it's okay to take time just to understand Jewishness and to live it. And that's something that has really benefited me, or I've benefited from in the past 4 months.
Thank you. The clock has beaten us, but the hour and a half has zoomed by, literally. I really just wanted to thank you both for giving up your time, especially to share your insights and perspective. It's really quite valuable. And thank you to everybody who contributed with a question or a point of view. I tried to ask and put over as many as possible, but there were quite a few I didn't get to. Apologies about that. But really just wanted to thank you, Ben and Natasha, for everything you've done for us this evening and for your work and your continued advocacy and activism. But I wish you all a good evening, safe journeys home. Most of you are home. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you very much for joining us.